Hello friends and gamers, and welcome to the Fortress. Today is going to be my first video I'm going to do in about a 6, 7, or 8 part series of JX36 Overhaul, which is an expansion or overhaul of Global War 1936 version 2. Now I hesitate to call it an expansion because expansion implies that it's endorsed by Historical Board Gaming, and this is not endorsed in any way. It's something I made completely independent of Historical Board Gaming in 2007. And although I have shown Doug Friend, the CEO or whatever, the owner of Historical Board Gaming, in my brief time I worked for him, this is something I already had built and in place prior to any of my involvement with Historical Board Gaming. So it's a system of house rules that would supersede and overlay on top of Global War 1936 version 2, and where it does overlay, it would supersede Global War 36, and where it doesn't overlay, then 36 vanilla rules would still apply. So that's the idea behind that. It was made in my bachelor years as kind of my taste. I wanted to make this game into something more and something to my liking, and it's full of flaws. It's definitely full of flaws, full of gray areas, full of flaws. It was play tested twice with a full table of players, and it was very interesting, but it definitely has flaws. Now, I would probably have a field day because I'm quite known for exploiting rules, or not exploiting, but working in the gray areas of the rules. I wouldn't say exploiting because I always work within the boundaries of the rules. I would have a field day with this, but the thing is, the more variety you add into the rules, the more chances there are to exploit things or work within gray areas. And so, yes, absolutely, this is a work in progress, so I call it JX36.8, version 0.8. It's a pre-official release, and it would probably take 2 or 3 or 4 releases before it would be something that would be stand on its own 2 feet, that kind of thing. So that caveat being in place, I want to quickly address a few key points. JX36 is no way endorsed by Historical Board Gaming. It's something I made completely independently. I'm not implying that any ideas I have here is something that HBG took and incorporated in their game, because ideas, good ideas tend to float to the top, right? And so people could come along multiple parallel paths to the same conclusion and outreach without anybody borrowing or taking ideas away from each other. So for instance, I took a lot of the good ideas I found in Global War 36 version 2, and I find in version 3 a lot of those same ideas percolate to the surface from the Historical Board Gaming community. So that's fantastic and it's awesome. Good rules. I love good rules. That's the key feature behind things. But this is a video I'm making by request of one of my subscribers and viewers, and so I wanted to share it because I might as well, instead of having it on a file on my computer, share it with the public and the people, and perhaps the house rules we put in here might be interesting for other people in the future to incorporate into their own games. Of course, it is outdated. That's the nature of things, and I can't keep up with it. I have no intention of bringing it out of hiatus and working on it. I got other projects and another board game I have in mind I want to design too, so that's the scoop behind this. But I want to go over at least the first page with you guys in this video, which will be roughly 20 minutes, I believe, and then the future ones might be 45 minutes or so. It does get into some depth later on. But let's just skim over the first page, where it deals with the politics, treaties, and Lend-Lease, kind of a nation's association with other nations. Okay, so first of all, national homeland. This is basic from version 2. Now, Scotland, Liverpool, London have now been renamed, and there's been another added territory to there, so this is a holdover from version 2. In 1936, we start at peace with all nations, that's standard, and surrender conditions are a little bit different in the fact that we have only half of our IPP is lost to Treasury when the capital is lost. So the idea behind that is IPP stands for Industrial Production Points. So production points aren't gathered at a capital. It's not like a video game where you have a stockpile and your workers carry the stockpile to next to your capital, and then from then on they distribute it to the factories. No, it's not like that. We theorize, or I theorize, I say we because I had a good friend of mine who was a sounding board for this. So we realized that when it comes to this kind of stuff, when it comes to London being captured, or any one of its capitals being captured, a lot of those production points are still spread across the country, in Gibraltar, Egypt, South Africa, and everywhere else as well as the rest of London, Scotland, and there's enough autonomy in provinces and territories that things will just keep on keeping on. Things will keep on chugging away. Yes, things will be destabilized, but not to the point where the nation itself grinds to a halt for one entire 6-month period. Now, the idea behind it is things will still press on. There will be still factories producing ammunition and guns even when the capital is lost, and capitals generally move fairly rapidly. Like the seat of government moves pretty quick. In in World War II, the seat of government was moving, or the French government was moving rapidly between there, was it Marseille? And then it flipped and they surrendered fully. There's other occasions too during the Franco-Prussian War where the seat of government moved prior to the capital being lost. So that's kind of the idea behind that. Things keep on keeping on. Next up, we have the British Commonwealth and what it means. So a lot of these wording are lifted from version 2. The only difference here is we have Canada is included, as well as South Africa. Now, historically, well, I added Canada because I'm Canadian, and historically Canada has just as much an impact as Anzac, and South Africa included because, again, the whole autonomy thing, like Britain and having its stockpile in London, well, South Africa is its own nation as well. Maybe it should have its independent factory and independent kind of nationality, and South Africans did have an impact in World War II as well. We don't want to negate that, as well as India and all these other nations as well. So we lump certain things together, but certain things we want to, I think for flavor basis, we add it as separate. Although South Africa only gets $3 of income, it's still kind of that borderline area that perhaps they should be included. Now, apart from that, everything is standard. Only one research role can be purchased per technology for the British Commonwealth per game round. What that means is if you're purchasing, say, wartime economy, you only get one roll of that, and not Canada, FEC, Anzac, and South Africa can't all each roll for the same tech. That would be a bit too much. Okay, so that takes care of kind of the domestic side of things. Now we look at foreign treaties. Now this game, what I wanted to do, and this is probably the weakest point in my expansion, so don't be disheartened by this. I wanted it somewhat sandboxy, so those are the two terminology points, sandbox versus railroad. A sandbox is kind of free-flowing where you can make and break alliances with who you want to make, and railroad is you're forced down a certain route, and there'll be a historical outcome that will always happen, and the more railroady you get, the more fixed the outcome is. So for instance, Allies will always win, or the Entente Cordiale will always win World War I. It's guaranteed. In World War II, it's a debate who won, Allies or Soviets, but those guys, one of those guys, or both of those guys will win kind of mentality. Now in this, I want a little bit more sandboxy, where you could theoretically do things a little bit. Not too much, but a little bit. The older I get, the less I like sandboxy elements because it's too unpredictable, and especially in a long game. You don't want to spend 2 days working on a game or playing through a game and then some young punk wants to try something different and then wrecks, not your whole weekend, because it's still going to be fun regardless, but we want some sort of expectation that there'll be a lot of good dice rolls and a lot of good World War II simulations. But let me explain what I got going on here. So the Allies, Great Britain has an alliance with the British Commonwealth. And the British Commonwealth is Great Britain, FEC, Canada, Anzac. It could theoretically break that alliance, but this isn't really what that would be for, because there'd be no reason to break that alliance, because you're playing all those minor nations, so there's no reason for it. But if you form an alliance with France or USA, you could theoretically break that later on if it makes a reason to. Now, it wouldn't, for the most part, but just in case. So what does an allied nation do? Well, they have mutual guarantees of independence. Everybody guarantees each other. You can use each other's bases and rails and may cooperate in research. Now that's a new feature as well. Aggressors may call ally to arms for $1 each when at war. So that means that if Britain is going to war against somebody and declares war, well, you could call somebody into the war to join you with $1 each. Now that may be tricky, and that may be a little gray area that could have will have some weaknesses, that's for sure. But independence guarantees, like if you're allied with somebody, you're guaranteeing their independence. So Great Britain guarantees the independence of France, as well as Belgium, Netherlands, Portugal. So France, first of all, used to be the bad boy. In the turn of the 19th century, is that what it is? With Napoleon, France was the bad boy of Europe. Now with Austro-Prussian War, where Prussia defeated Austria, France and Germany were perceived kind of equal, but France was still considered the dangerous foe of Europe. And it wasn't until the Franco-Prussian War, where the Prussian Empire defeated the French, that Prussia, or the now Germany, took that mantle of the bad boy of Europe. So people forget now and think that France has always been our ally, but it's 200 years. It's not that long ago, a couple of generations ago. And there was, I know it's more than a couple, but there was some dangerous, people perceived France dangerously, right? So Great Britain guarantees the independence of France. But Great Britain also cares more about Belgium and Netherlands. That's why Great Britain joined World War I, partially because of France, but partially because Belgium was invaded, and that was a threat to their security. There's this book called Diplomacy by Kissinger that deals with this quite well. It's very nice. It's a good book, excellent book, and explains this quite a bit. Also the involvement of America in World War II, and quite handily. So Portugal was one of Britain's earliest or longest allies, going way, way, way back when, even prior to the Napoleonic War, so 200 years. It's known as Britain's longest ally. So Great Britain guarantees Portugal, and it guarantees Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Oman, Yemen, etc., etc. And this is all historical as well. You know, there were guarantees of independence. You could even find it on Wikipedia what it's not called the same, but similar treaties and such. But also Italy. Italy is because World War I. There's this something called the stress affront that in 1936, Italy was still considered kind of on the fence, the untrustworthy ally of Great Britain in World War, in the interwar period. And it wasn't until the annexations of Austria that Italy did kind of flip sides and join Germany. Now, likewise, in World War I, Italy sat on the fence and was technically an ally of Austria, and then broke free when it saw that Germany was the Central Powers in a weak position and flipped sides. So that's why this position here, where Italy is actually guaranteed by Britain. Now, there's events that will come up that Italy will move from the Allied camp to the Axis camp, but that's for another video, perhaps when I deal with Italy. So you can break these treaties with a certain amount of penalty. So half your wartime income, or if it's greater, 8 IPP. Now, Britain's wartime income is 19 IPP, so half of that would be roughly, well, you round it up, so that you'd round it up to $10, which actually turns out to what version 3 rules actually have for declaring war on neutral nations. So that's quite handy. Now, what does it mean to guarantee a nation? Well, you basically, if somebody declares war against them, the guarantor immediately joins at no cost. So that's what a person can be. Yeah, or you could break your guarantee at that point, but yeah, you would join the war at no cost, which means that if somebody declares war on the Anzac, then Great Britain would automatically be at war as well. So that's the situation there. Now, you also have something called non-aggression treaties, which you have against the United States, Greece, Yugoslavia, Romania, Switzerland, nationalist China. Like, all these are based in historical fact. You could look them into them on Wikipedia and such and find the truth there as well. Now, you could also break those if you so choose to do so. The penalty is less, but it's still gonna hurt a little bit to break your non-aggression treaties. Basically, you can't declare war against each other unless you break the treaty at the specified penalty. Unless you also join if nation joins faction at war with its signatory. So, for instance, if Japan and Axis Germany, they're not technically part of the same faction yet. That comes through an event. But if Germany's at war with Russia and then Japan joins the Axis, then they would break their non-aggression treaty with the Soviets. This is basically to try to copy the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to make it a little bit punishing to the attacker and the defender. So that's kind of the idea there. Now, I know there's going to be some loopholes there with the Japo-Soviet or Sino-Soviet non-aggression treaty, and so that's not going to work out perfectly with history, but it is my best attempt. Okay, how do you make treaties? Because you can't make treaties without an event. It would look something like this, and there would probably be eventually, as time went on to different versions, additional treaties a person can play by event like this, and you can do these at any time if you fulfill the conditions. So the Anglo-Polish military alliance can be formed, and the outcome of that is you would guarantee the independence of Poland. So if somebody declares war on Poland, you would be at war with the aggressor who declared war on Poland. The conditions of that, though, are a second nation has been annexed in Europe. So Germany would have to annex, say, Austria and Sudetenland, as it was in version 2, and then Britain would guarantee Poland. Now, of course, Germany could also declare war against Poland without annexing Austria, and that's something that we could deal with on the German sheet if we ever get to that, which I don't think we will unless demand is high, but that's the idea behind that. Germany could still go to war because it wasn't perceived as an aggressor until it had annexed all these nations, so there should be some freedom behind that. Of course, Britain has guaranteed the independence of the Netherlands and Belgium, so there's limitations on who Germany can attack. But they can definitely attack. It could definitely attack the Czechs, let's say, and it could also attack the Polish. but that would increase the peacetime income of Britain as well through other means as well. So that's the idea there. Now, the Anglo-French alliance was not something that we had in 1936, something that came a little bit later in a more official form. Before that, in 1936, the French were trying to make their own little series of alliances called the Little Entente, as a holdover from World War I, where they tried to get the Czechs, the Romanians, I believe they were part of this thing called the Little Entente, and it was just a separate alliance that they had themselves. So you'll see that reflected in any French sheet I may post up. And so the Anglo-French alliance was not actually signed until a little later. In this case, when Britain and France are at war against a mutual enemy, and Britain and France are at peace with each other, then the Britain, British allies, and France may form an alliance. So they'll all be kind of at war together, basically. Yeah. Anglo-Iraq Treaty annulled. So you could also annul it this way. If Britain no longer receives a certain bonus that they get on their wartime income, Mosul and Kirkuk oil field bonus, and Iraq is not a British ally, Britain annuls its guarantee of independence of Iraq, and Britain may declare war on Iraq with no penalty. This is a historical thing too. I can't remember what it's called. Something for hits my head with golden carpet. I could have that completely wrong. Maybe that was the name of like this movement that was trying to overthrow the Iraq regime. It wasn't necessarily golden carpet. I need to look into that bit of history as well, but yeah, we'll later date. Okay, so that's how to make treaties and also how to annul some treaties as well. So the German reference sheet will have more of this, and Italians will be pretty interesting where if, for instance, Germany annexes Austria, Italy will move from the Stresa front from being kind of in more the Allied camp and drift towards the Axis camp. And then if Germany annexes a second nation, Bohemia, let's say, or Sudetenland as it used to be called, then Axis will step into that Allied camp, and Axis camp, and join the Axis. Historical as well. If you look at the historic dates of when Germany and Italy kind of firmed up their alliances, it was after those two events occurred. Okay, let's talk about this last page, which will be our last little bit. Declarations of war. Can Great Britain declare war against major nations? Yes, once you're at full production. War penalty, which is this over here, is waived if the major nation has been an aggressor in an international war against any nation. Now, international war is there because you could actually spark off civil wars in foreign nations, as Great Britain spark off a civil war in Argentina, Brazil, anywhere that's a neutral nation, or even a major nation. Even Germany could spark a war there. It'll be very weak. You'll only start a partisan, and then it'll be rapidly crushed by the German forces. So it'll be detrimental. But some nations that don't have much going for themselves, like say, for instance, let's see, Venezuela, you can civil war there and be reasonably successful with that kind of thing. So it has to be international war. So if Germany has been aggressor against an international war against, say, Poland, so now Britain could declare war against Germany, but it has to suffer 1/4 of its wartime income as penalty. Well, sorry, it won't because there's no war penalty paid. So 1/4 of its income would be, what would it be, $5? That's not huge. But you can theoretically declare war in 1936, but it doesn't benefit you because Germany is much stronger than Britain in 1936. You would, of course, still have to pay any treaty-breaking penalty that you have existent. So, for instance, if you're allied with Italians, you would still have to break it and suffer either half your wartime income of $10 or $8 to break that treaty. Now, that's not very punishing to the British, so maybe that should be greater, but that's the idea there. It all has to come out of the British pocket, though. It can't be shared amongst the allies. And additionally, that's a good chunk of its income. Additionally, it also is detrimental to the USA, if I remember correctly. Okay, you could declare war against minor nations once at full production. So basically a similar situation with international war. Now, the minor nation will likely not spark an international war against any other nation, but there is room for expansions to work on this if need be. If a minor nation, say the Netherlands, we want there to be that ability for things to happen there. Can Lend-Lease, so Lend-Lease. Can the Great Britain Lend-Lease to the British Commonwealth? Only Lend-Lease to one Commonwealth nation each turn. So the downside of this here is that I don't remember what the Canadian and the FEC and the ANZAC thing says, but theoretically you could send one unit from each of these Commonwealth nations to another recipient of the Commonwealth nation. Now keep in mind, in this version of the rules, Lend-Lease travels differently. In Operation Winter Solace, my recently completed version 3 Global War 36 game, I never once had an issue with Lend-Lease being interdicted. Not once. There's always a way to get Lend-Lease through. You send it through a different port, or you make the receiving port different, or you send it from somebody else, and you never have an issue. So in this case, Lend-Lease travels along convoy routes as much as it can, and then skips across to somewhere else, making it more predictable where the Lend-Lease is going to be shipped to, which makes submarines more handy and also escorting more necessary as well. So what can you Lend-Lease? 1 unit, half recipient's income, or 1 resource. So there's 4 different types of resources, depends on what options you want to play. There's oil, there's uranium, there's heavy water, and then there's supply. So you could Lend-Lease one of those ones. Now, what about any other nation? Can Great Britain Lend-Lease to France? Only on the turn no other member of the British Commonwealth has Lend-Leased. So you can't do the same thing about Lend-Leasing to the British Commonwealth. You can't send 4 units basically to those places. If Great Britain Lend-Leases to France, so then the Anzac can't also Lend-Lease to any other nation. Now, one quick touch on this British Commonwealth thing. So it does mean you could rapidly reinforce certain areas. You could Lend-Lease from Anzac, Canada, South Africa, and the FEC to London, let's say. So that's 4 extra units that could pop into London. The fact that Lend-Lease has to travel along Lend-Lease routes, or convoy routes rather, means that it's more predictable and more easy to stop. But also, if you take a step back and say, if in version 2 of the rules, each year is 6 months, and in this JX36, each year is actually only 4 months. So that means that in 4 months, you could travel the globe pretty easily. You know, like, what's that story? Around the world in 80 days? I mean, you could do that in less in this modern time, right? It doesn't take that long. Like, it would take, I believe somebody was telling me, I think Hilltop Pillbox was saying, it only took like 7 days. Or maybe it was the Titanic. It only takes 7 days to get across the Atlantic. So theoretically, in 4 months, you could probably get 30,000 infantry from, Anzac, Sydney to London, if you wanted to, and the convoy routes aren't blockaded. So that's one way of looking at it. Okay. Now, how does blockading work? So let's talk about the detrimental side of things. 3 surface warships, 3 enemy surface warships, and that's not 3 individual ships, it's 3 surface war tokens, or figurines, blockade a sea zone from passing enemy Lend-Lease. 2 surface warships blockade a harbor or naval base from enemy Lend-Lease. A figurine for a destroyer is roughly 30 destroyers, I believe. Maybe it's as little as 16, but it's between 16 and 30. So 2 surface warships at minimum is going to be roughly 30 vessels, 30 hulls, or as much as 60 hulls blocking Lend-Lease along the coast. I think that's sufficient to patrol the whole coast and blockade it, I think. And 3 surface warships, like sea zones are fairly big, so 3 surface warships or 3 surface figurines should be sufficient to block a sea zone. So you can do some pretty dramatic blocking with that. And that's because I found that blockading was a little bit too weak and it took too much effort to do. Okay, how does Lend-Lease be shipped and transported? If you go over land routes, then it's something like this. You see here between Norway and Sweden. So this is a land route. It goes along an undamaged railway. So in this case, it's the example of Norway Lend-Leasing to Sweden for whatever reason, right? Not that Norway would, but that's one option. And water route. So in version 2, you only had 2 types of naval bases, 3. You had ports, shipyards, and I guess submarine pens. So they're all called naval bases. So you can send via naval bases, and I made something else called harbors, which you see in version 2 you had railways would kind of go all the way up to the coast and within like a millimeter or 2 of the coast and just stop. So I call those harbors, and you see already 3 in this image here in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. So that's what those railways harbor coast would be. Now in version 3, of course, that included dry docks, so major minor dry dock, major minor shipyard, major minor naval port, what else? Major minor submarine, not pens, what do they call it? Submarine base, and perhaps major minor submarine pens as well, and then also seaplane bases. So there's a lot of bases now in version 3, but in version 2 we only had a few different types, so I wanted to add other ways for Lend-Lease to be flowing in. So that's it for page 1. So how the diplomacy and how it works for JX36 in regards to internal affairs, kind of external affairs with treaties and alliances, how to make more treaties and alliances, how to declare war, and how to Lend-Lease to people, and a little bit how Lend-Lease works. That's it, people. Thank you all for watching. Cheers.